after it was over, I thought Moreno had done the winning decision.
Figueiredo gets the win here, that he's going to be the fighter of the year.
Decision, Brandon, the assassin, baby!
Having a bitter rival can be frustrating, especially in a combat sport like MMA. Still, at the same time, it can be beneficial. Competing with a rival motivates, inspires, and pushes people toward greatness. The energy created in a good rivalry between two fighters helps them focus on their efforts and fosters rewards. Every great UFC fighter had a rival who constantly pushed him to become a better version of himself. In the past, Dominic Cruz had Uriah Faber, Anderson Silva had Chael Sonnen, and John Jones had Daniel Cormier. While those rivalries are in the past, we live at a time when one of the biggest rivalries in UFC history was born. Deiveson Figueiredo versus Brandon Moreno. They need to settle a score and are scheduled to fight for the 4th time. Let's take a look at how these two warriors rose to the top to become the rivals that everyone is hyped to watch, and how they have made the UFC flyweight division great again. Deivison Figueiredo was 11-0 in his professional MMA career before signing with the UFC in 2017. He won 10 of those fights by stoppage, breaking the myth that flyweights don't possess that finishing ability like their fellow heavyweights. Before turning pro in MMA, Figueiredo worked as a bricklayer, hairdresser, and as a sushi chef. Starting from such humble beginnings makes his success in the UFC even more impressive. In his UFC debut, Deivison faced the Mexican fighter Marco Beltran. The power and pressure of the Brazilian fighter were too much for Beltran to withstand, and this fight was stopped by corner stoppage after round 2.
That was a beautiful time elbow. And at that point made the decision to stop the fight.
Figueiredo's next UFC appearance was not as impressive as the previous, and he won that fight against Jared Brooks by a split decision.
Right there, get attacked, double leg, 10 seconds short time for the winner by split decision.
Nevertheless, the next 2 fights against Joseph Morales and John Moraga indicated that Deivison possesses a power that nobody should reckon with. He won both of those contests by a second-round TKO.
It was that left hook. Doesn't even really look like...
The one who took Figueiredo's zero was his fellow Brazilian, José Formiga. There was no shame in losing to this UFC veteran, who held an impressive record of 22-5 when they met. This loss will be the first learning experience for Deus da Guerra, and will push him to become a better version of himself.
Take chances. He's got to just get in for him, he gets fair.
Sure enough, he returned with a convincing unanimous decision victory against Alexandre Pantoja, and also submitted Tim Elliott via guillotine choke in the first round. Being 5-1 since signing with the promotion was convincing enough to earn his first title shot, where he faced the UFC legend Joseph Benavidez. Figueiredo was heavily criticized for not making weight in that fight and entered the octagon as the villain, even though he convincingly beat Benavidez via TKO in the second round. His victory was tainted, considering that he was 2.5 pounds over the title fight limit. To shut the critics and doubts that he was champion material, Figueiredo fought Benavidez again that year. This time, besides being on weight, he beat Joseph again, even more convincingly than the last time, via a rear naked choke in the first round.
Never been submitted.
Conscious referee.
Oh, he's out. He's out.
Deus da Guerra was supposed to defend his belt against Cody Garbrandt on November 21, 2020. However, the former champion had torn his bicep and was forced to pull out of the fight. Alex Perez replaced Cody, but was no match for the Brazilian fighter who won that bout via a first-round guillotine choke. Figueiredo set the record for the UFC's fastest championship turnaround at 21 days on December 12, 2020, when he faced his nemesis, Brandon Moreno. This fight turned out to be the overture of one of the greatest rivalries in UFC history. Compared to Deivison, Moreno did not have an impressive start in MMA. He was 3-3 in his first 6 MMA appearances and lost to Alexandre Pantoja in the opening stage of the Ultimate Fighter Tournament of Champions in 2016. The Mexican fighter is a concrete example of someone who never gives up on his dreams and doesn't let any obstacle prevent him from achieving his goals. From 2012 to 2016, He went on an 8-fight winning streak, finishing 6 of his opponents, 4 by rear naked choke, indicating that this submission is his signature move. After losing in the Ultimate Fighter show in 2016, Moreno signed with the promotion and made his first professional UFC appearance on October 1st, 2016 against Louis Smolka. He won that fight via guillotine choke. Moreno's second UFC bout was against Ryan Benoit. In a back-and-forth fight, he edged Ryan on the judges' scorecards and won that fight via split decision.
Split decision, Brandon!
Nevertheless, in his next UFC appearance, he reminded everyone of his signature move by winning against Dustin Ortiz via a rear naked choke. Sergio Pettis and Alexandre Pantoja ruined Moreno's plans and took him a step back in his goal for the UFC title. Both these fighters beat the Mexican via unanimous decision. And he left the UFC for a short time to rebuild himself and returned better than ever. He fought Michael Perez in LFA 69, beating him via TKO in the 4th round, a victory that would earn him the LFA Flyweight Championship.
Champion Brandon, the assassin, baby!
However, Brandon was determined to prove to the world that he belonged to the UFC and that the UFC belt was his ultimate goal. After a short step back, he returned to the organization and fought Askar Askarov in a close fight that was determined as a draw. Nevertheless, the 2 dominant decision victories against Kai Kara France and Jussier Formiga and the TKO finish against Brandon Royval in the 1st round would earn Moreno a shot for the flyweight title against his future rival, Deivison Figueiredo. On November 21st, 2020, Figueiredo and Moreno both fought different people at UFC 255. It was only 21 days later that they would fight each other for the first time at UFC 256 on December 12, 2020. This fight was arguably the best in UFC flyweight history. Not so long ago, there were rumors of shutting down this division due to a lack of interest in watching it. These 2 fighters kept the viewers on the edge of their seats and changed the perspective of whether the flyweights could bring thrill and excitement to the octagon.
Clinch exchange.
While Brandon Moreno was the more technical fighter, throwing different combinations and countering Deivison's attacks, Deivison Figueiredo, on the other hand, proved to be the more powerful fighter, whose strikes were way more effective when landed. Whenever they got into a brawl and exchanged punches, Figueiredo was getting the better of Moreno due to his power and brutal strength.
This is a wild fight.
In some of his previous fights, Moreno was also known to be a wild fighter. Whenever Figueiredo tried to turn this fight into a brawl, Brandon's instinct would make him follow that lead and lose in these exchanges. But whenever he was composed and patient, he would throw beautiful technical combinations from a distance, landing effectively on Deivison.
Good left hand to the body by Moreno there.
Deus da Guerra proved to have a granite chin. Even though there were moments when he would take more than a few consecutive strikes to his head, he would not even budge, like they did not affect him at all.
Look at that. Look at this. My goodness. Oh, Moreno.
Brandon Moreno was very heavy on his lead leg. He would throw a left jab and always move to his left, but at the same time, he would drop his left hand, which is a big mistake. If Figueiredo threw a big overhand right or a high kick whenever Moreno dropped his left hand, that fight could have been over. Also, being heavy on the lead leg could make him very vulnerable to absorbing leg kicks. Luckily for Moreno, Deivison was doing something similar. The Brazilian fighter was constantly leaning on his left where he would throw bombs with bad intentions. At one point, Moreno figured that out and started intercepting Deivison's movement while leaning on his left. As previously mentioned, Moreno proved to be the more technical fighter. Figueiredo would throw big punches without setting them up, and Moreno could predict those. He would roll under Figueiredo's hook, counter it with a hook to the body, and land another punch to the head. Brandon worked much more than Deivison by constantly throwing beautiful combinations and countering the Brazilian fighter with jabs and hooks. Still, the judging criteria says that damage trumps everything, and the Brazilian fighter possessing the destructive power in his hands could change the entire progress and dynamic of the fight. This is precisely what happened multiple times. The Mexican would be leading Figueiredo in the technical exchanges during the first round. That's until the Brazilian threw a big high kick that stunned Moreno. To Moreno's credit, he tried to block the kick, but still, the precision played a significant role. That kick would still land clean on the upper side of Moreno's head. From here on, Deivison pressed forward with vicious punches, throwing a nasty elbow, and showed that he has that aggressive instinct of a killer. If Figueiredo senses that he hurt you with a punch, he will follow up with wild combinations and not let you breathe. Moreno, on the other hand, had to make some adjustments mid-fight. Besides starting to intercept Deivison with a hook whenever he leaned to his left, Brandon began to mix combinations with takedowns and took the Brazilian fighter to the ground a few times.
Look at that.
Moreno proved to be the more technical fighter. At the same time, Figueiredo relied on his power, granite chin, and ability to exchange in a brawl. If it weren't for the point deduction in the third round due to the groin strike, Deivison would have won that fight since he caused more damage in the exchanges. The back and forth battle ended in a draw, and both fighters would earn the Fight of the Night bonus. This epic battle left fans amazed, and a rematch was inevitable. Both fighters had some adjustments to make, and both needed full camps in order to display their actual capabilities.
And Brandon Moreno go the 25-minute distance.
Deivison even said he was battling a stomach infection that had him hospitalized just one day before the fight.
Deus da Guerra, Figueiredo!
However, a score had to be settled, and the rematch was scheduled for June 12, 2021 at UFC 263. Figueiredo entered the rematch as a favorite, considering that he could have won the first fight if he didn't have a point deducted. Many thought that the Brazilian fighter would beat Moreno very convincingly this time. Nevertheless, the Mexican fighter had different plans that night.
Definitely different look than the first fight.
Moreno entered that fight sharp from the beginning, and it was evident that he made some crucial adjustments to beat his new rival. His jabs were very effective. He threw leg kicks and combinations, but at the same time, unlike the first fight, he wasn't engaging in a brawl. He was picking Figueiredo apart from a distance, landing 5 times more strikes than him in the first round. And then, at the end of the first round, Moreno threw a huge jab that knocked Deivison down. Brandon will follow up on that with ground and pound strikes, but the Brazilian fighter will find his way back up to his feet. This could arguably be a 10 to 8 round in favor of Moreno.
A bit more cautious and definitely more respectful of what Brandon Moreno can do.
In the second round, Moreno showed grappling superiority over Deivison, winning that round as well.
Bad news.
Oh, look at this. Brandon Moreno takes him down and gets his neck.
Everyone knew that all that it takes for Deus da Guerra is to let loose the nuclear power he possesses in his hands. However, the button will never be pressed, and as the third round started, Moreno took Figueiredo to the ground, took his back, and submitted him via rear naked choke. The flyweight division got a new champion, and a trilogy was targeted immediately.
Flyweight champion of the world, Brandon!
The trilogy bout for the UFC Flyweight Championship was set for January 22, 2022 at UFC 270.
Figueiredo's stance is the same stance Cejudo came out against Dominic Cruz.
As iron sharpens iron, Figueiredo trained with Henry Cejudo at Fight Ready. This way he could work on his wrestling and prepare for Moreno better. This fight was a back and forth battle and a technical exchange on another level. Deivison made some significant adjustments this time, kicking Moreno's lead leg to unbalance the Mexican fighter. This allowed him to better execute his game plan. And sure enough, this time, Figueiredo's power played a crucial role in the fight's outcome. The Brazilian fighter knocked Moreno down multiple times and won the first and third rounds, while his bitter rival won the second. However, the 4th and 5th were very close, and to this day, people are still debating who won that fight. If we look closer at the 4th round, it should clearly belong to Moreno. In a stand-up exchange battle, the Mexican landed 22 strikes compared to Deivison's 14. There were no knockdowns, and nothing crazy happened in this round. All things considered, they should have entered the 5th round as 2-2 on the scorecards.
And it's hard to judge these first 4 rounds.
And then, the 5th round was arguably the closest. Brandon Moreno executed a takedown, but it didn't cause much damage. And according to the judges' criteria, damage trumps everything. Speaking of damage, even though Moreno landed more strikes than Figueiredo in that round, the Brazilian fighter landed 3 heavy strikes that trumped the previous. The judges' criteria don't say that whoever lands more punches wins.
That's a big right from the Brazilian. Now another one.
It says that causing damage is the most crucial aspect of winning a round. Sure enough, Deivison did way more damage and won that round fair. Deivison Figueiredo is now the new flyweight world champion. Many people saw this fight as a robbery, believing that Moreno did enough to top his Brazilian rival on the scorecards. However, Brandon is a very humble and lovable fighter, so maybe people just don't want to see him lose. But the truth is, Deivison Figueiredo was the slightly better man that night, although he barely did enough to beat the Mexican on the scorecards.
There's a big right hand. That's the one.
The rivalry is now 1-1, and they have one fight as a draw. Scheduling a 4th fight to settle the score was inevitable, especially after Brandon Moreno's incredible performance against Kai Kara France. At the end of the day, who wouldn't like to watch these two fight again? Whenever they enter the octagon, they put on a show and keep the fans on the edge of their seats. Brazil and Mexico now do not rival only in football, but also in MMA.
Figueiredo with a right hand over the top.
All thanks to their fellow compatriots who have already battled 3 times in the past. It's tough to predict how the 4th bout between these two would go. Would Moreno's skill and technique somehow avoid Figueiredo's power and lead him in that fight? Or would Deivison's power play a significant role, leading him to have his hands raised once again? This fight is so unpredictable, and it all comes to whoever implements their gameplay better.